Hello and welcome to The Reassembler with me, James May. It's a show where we put things back together again. That's it. Sort of familiar bit. It is only when these objects are laid out in hundreds of bits and then slowly reassembled dun, 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 that you can truly understand and appreciate how they work and just how ingenious they are. Deep joy. And if painstakingly putting hundreds of pieces back together again, oh God, it's electrics, wasn't hard enough, fantastic, we've used all the bits. I then have to find out, oh yes, if they'll work. No, it's all come apart. Even when it is presented like this, ruthlessly stripped down to its last nut and bolt, you will of course have recognised that this is the seminal 1959 Suffolk Colt 12-inch 4-stroke petrol lawnmower. The people's lawnmower. The lawnmower that revolutionised the idea of popular grass cutting. And it is fashionable these days to deconstruct history, but that's not what we're going to do here. We are going to put history back together again. I have as long as it takes to reassemble this beast from a pile of 331 lawnmower-y type bits. And to help me, I have a 50-year-old owner's manual and some tea. Right, we'll start with the engine because that's what makes this a petrol lawnmower. If it didn't have a petrol engine, it would merely be a lawnmower. The first bits to go into the engine are the valves that control the flow of fuel and exhaust gases in and out of the cylinder. This might be a good time to tell you a little bit about the history of the lawnmower, which was invented by Edwin Beard Budding in 1830. He was actually inspired by a machine that removed the pilling, or whatever you call it, from fabric at a factory that made uniforms for army officers, I think. And he saw that and thought, if I make it a bit bigger, it would cut the grass in a very neat, uniform way. A lot of people thought Budding was a lunatic for wanting to make a machine to cut grass. Apparently he had to test it at night so that people wouldn't see him and throw stones at him and all the rest of it. There you go. Right, this is the camshaft and this is the camshaft spindle. And it is very, very important to note, and I'm going to check that this fits anyway first. There's no reason why it shouldn't, but it doesn't. Or does it? Now this is risky because if you tap something in, even with a very, very benign hammer like this nylon-headed one, that's all very well, but you can't then easily tap it back out. And there's also a danger that as this goes through, it will create a small burr or a scratch on there that will then stop it passing cleanly through the middle of the camshaft. So I'm a bit reluctant to do it, but the man who took this apart for me keeps telling me it's a lawnmower, meaning it's not the engine out of a high-performance fighter aircraft. Right, this is a little bit one way. That's in now. That's only going to come out by going the other way with the punch, so. And you see that, look, there's the camshaft spinning nice and cleanly, and you can see the cams just starting to act on the ends of the tappets. That's what opens and closes the valves. Yeah, that's all moving nicely. And the pin is going through. Over the last 57 minutes, I have assembled the camshaft, the tappet, and the remaining valve. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. Right, next I'm going to need the all-important crankshaft, which is that bit there. And I'm going to need the 4 screws to retain it. I should really clean my hands before doing this bit because it's precision engineering. Now, the crankshaft is obviously a critical part of the internal combustion engine. It's the most significant part in a way because it's what converts all that furious combustion action and reciprocating motion into something going round and round, which is what we want from a machine. It's what we wanted from the water wheel powered mills of the Industrial Revolution. That's what you need. And we've got this rather nice little thing here. This is German, so it works well. So there's a little demonstration of how the internal combustion four-stroke engine works. Piston goes up, as it goes down, that valve opens, and it's sucking in fuel from the carburetor side. Now that valve closes, the piston goes up, bang, the spark plug fires, wow, down it goes. As it comes up the next time, that valve opens, that's the exhaust, so all the spent gases are pushed out, and then it starts again. So it's obvious that the relationship between the crankshaft and the camshaft, which is what's pushing the valves up and down, is very important, because if the valves don't open at the right point, then it isn't going to work. And also, if you get it wrong, you won't find that out until the whole thing is assembled and you pull the piece of string and it doesn't go. Then you'll have to take it apart again, and we'll be back with looking for the spring compressor and so on. So would everybody agree that that is top dead centre? There. So the piston is at the top of its stroke, both the valves are closed, but if you rotate it either way, either one is ready to open. So that should make the timing correct. There's no other real way of checking it, apart from assembling the whole thing and seeing if it works. So let's do that. There will be a satisfying clunking noise any second as this goes home. Now, if this was a Japanese motorcycle engine, there'd be an actual torque setting for all of these, but you sort of do things up until they feel about right. So let's call that tight, and that one is tight, and then we'll go for they're even. Excellent. We now need, and this is a nerve-wracking bit, the piston, the connecting rod, the gudgeon pin, the circlips, and the piston rings. That is the piston. That is the connecting rod. And these are the very delicate piston rings. Yes, there you go. Sorry about the slight cut, but there was some blasphemy. I have two of the piston rings on. The bottom one, the oil control ring, and the middle one, which is the oil scraper. I didn't want you to share my trauma as I did that. It's a very, very fiddly, nerve-wracking job, but I've saved the last one for you to watch. This is the compression ring, and now it's a simple matter of finding your inner power animal. Oh, man. You have to spread it. It could... Now, before we put that in, we have to put the con rod on. It's worth remembering that the piston goes up and down inside the cylinder in a straight line, but because the crankshaft is going round and round and has a throw on it, the connecting rod has to do that, has to go from side to side. So obviously it has to pivot at this end, otherwise it would just shatter. Well, that's interesting. That ought to just slide in very smoothly, but without any of this resistance. Why doesn't it just go in? Bloody British rubbish. Good God. That looks like it was a machine with a knife and fork by the council. There are two possible solutions here. There's the lawnmower solution, which would be give it a gentle whack to take it past that problem, or there is the aerospace solution, which is remove that little bit. I'm inclined by nature to go for the aerospace solution because it's more proper. So what do we think, crew? Take the clip out of the other side or hit it with a hammer?
Hammer.
Hammer? Hammer? You're all wrong. If I hit that with a hammer, my reputation is ruined. I told you we should have hit it with a hammer. Hit it. It's not proper though. The con rod moves freely, that's a good sign. And now the defining component of the piston engine is about to go in. The piston. Now, to secure that from the other end, we need the big end cap there. This little clip, the two screws that hold it together, and this, which is the oil splasher. I'll explain this in a minute. Come and have a look at this. But the bottom of the engine, if you imagine it's all assembled, it's that way up, is the sump with the oil in it. The oil has to circulate, it's flung up onto the engine, it goes through various holes and channels, and it's flung up onto the engine and it goes through various holes and channels and what have you. But to help that, you've got this little oil splasher. It's just a little dibber. As the engine goes round and round, it will do that in the oil, stir it up a bit and splash it around. Obviously, it's going extremely quickly, much more quickly than that, quicker than I can even do it, actually, at my age. But the interesting thing about, well, I say interesting, it's mildly interesting if you're interested in that sort of thing, is that the Suffolk Iron Foundry made the whole lawnmower, a bit like Ford did with cars in its earlier days. So it didn't just buy an engine in from, say, a motorcycle manufacturer, it made it itself. So all these castings and all these machine bits all came out of the same factory that was making the blades, the rollers, the pressed steel, for the casing, the grass box and all that sort of thing. It all came from the same place. Do you know the very first petrol engine thing I ever drove was a lawnmower? It was a twin clutch device, a bit bigger than this one, that my parents owned, and it lived in a shed in the garden. And when I was about 12 years old, I worked out how you started it. And I used to lie awake at night, excitedly thinking about how I could get up in 7 hours' time and mow the grass again, even though I'd mown it at 6 p.m. the previous day. And to be a blade of grass in our garden in those days was a very ephemeral existence. And I loved this thing. And then I lent it to a mate many years later because I didn't have a lawn in my house in London. And while I wasn't looking, he sold it on eBay. Are you ready? Here's a legitimate use of the hammer. That's why it's a nylon headed hammer, so that it doesn't damage these delicate aluminium parts. I've attached the sump. I'm now going to very carefully turn the engine over, now the right way up, and finally we can stand it on the bench safely. This is a form of lower middle class tyranny and oppression, because in the early days of lawns as we understand them, all neat and evenly shorn, that was a sort of privilege of the toffs, really, because it was so expensive to have a lawn cut that way. You needed people who were skilled with scythes and so on to do it. It's an incredibly difficult job and therefore very expensive. But with the invention of the lawn mower, and particularly the petrol lawn mower, everybody could make their lawn look like that. And it actually became a matter of pride and respectability for your lawn, even if it's only, 15 feet by 15 feet in front of your small semi-detached house. It had to be neat, because even I remember as a kid, there were some people whose lawns weren't properly mown, and you knew that they were disreputable. People would say, yeah, but have you seen their lawn? And the fact that it was that long, meant that they were basically thieves and murderers. But anyway, there you are. Engine going around. You want to see the piston go up and down? Look at that. Fuel air mixture goes in there, drives that down, it comes up, exhausts, gets some more in, bang, 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 and as a result of that, your lawn is mown. Good, isn't it? Now we are going to attach, this is a deeply exciting moment, the magneto. And a magneto can be thought of as a mechanical spark generator. In most cars and motorcycles, you would have a coil and battery system as invented by AC Delco. But this is a much simpler idea. You simply have a mechanical motion that induces a current and creates a spark. And the great thing about this is you don't need a battery in the system, and this will run regardless of any other failure, because it will continue to do that and it will continue to make a spark. Now, you may well know ignition on a petrol engine requires timing so that it happens at the right moment when the piston is in the right position. Would you say that was roughly in the middle? I would. There you go. This is the flywheel. It's not in perfect condition, but then neither am I, and this is even older than me. Okay. That all looks good. Therefore, I can put on the washer and the flywheel retaining nut, which has to be done up very tightly Otherwise, this will fly off in operation and set off and mow the lawn and quite a lot of the surrounding area all by itself. You ready?
Yeah.
That is tight. Okay, I think we can put the cylinder head on, which is this. Do we like that? I believe we do. 2 long studs go that side.
We are now 3 hours and 21 minutes into our attempt to reassemble a 1959 petrol lawnmower, and not a minute's been wasted. So far, I've put in the valves, the crankshaft, the tricky piston rings, the sump, the magneto, flywheel and cylinder head. The engine is nearly complete as I tighten the last nut on the valve chest.
Excellent. Let us think about the carburetor. There are a lot of bits to this, quite delicate bits, but they're also rather wonderful. I will take those. That'll do for starters. What it does is it combines fuel from the tank, i.e. petrol in this case, with oxygen from the air, because the vast majority of what an internal combustion engine burns is, in fact, oxygen, not the fuel that you put in the tank. And it's called a carburetor because it adds carbon to the air, i.e. it adds petrol to the air, then squirts it in the engine. Let's get some more bits. Gasket and a jet, some washers, lovely. Selection of screws. Okay, let's have a go at this. So I did need to use both hands and my gob to get that in, but it's in. The butterfly regulates the amount of air that's allowed to enter the carburetor, therefore the amount that gets sucked through the venturi, therefore the amount of fuel that's picked up, and therefore how fast or how strongly the engine runs. And carburetor science is an extremely complicated thing that goes all the way back to the dawn of internal combustion piston engines, obviously, because you needed a carburetor of some sort. They were very, very crude in the early ones. This is a pretty simple carburetor by the standards of an advanced car or motorcycle or aero engine, but nevertheless it's quite a clever thing. But one of the things that we think of with a petrol engine on a, say, a lawnmower or a small bike, you think, well, the fuel goes in the tank, and it does, and the tank feeds the engine, but actually the carburetor itself has like a miniature fuel tank in it, which is this bit, the float bowl, and the float itself is a way, it works exactly like the ball cock in the cistern of your lavatory at home to make sure that the level of fuel in that float bowl remains constant. If it drops a bit, this goes down, some more comes in. As it goes up, it cuts off the little valve and stops it. And the point of that is that with the level of the fuel in that float bowl, the miniature fuel tank kept constant, it can feed through the jets, which are the tiny little holes that allow the fuel to go into the airstream and therefore regulate the fuel going into the engine. I'm simplifying it massively. It's very, very, there's a huge amount of physics and all that stuff in it. So that can go in there. What else do I need to put on the bottom half? What the hell is that? Strangler flap? Oh, I think they mean the choke. Oh, this has a different choke, because that's right. This is not entirely right for this. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Yeah, that is the strangler flap. They mean the choke butterfly. Okay, that's already in. Good, good, good. That gasket will go on there, like so. That's the bottom, the float bowl half of the carburetor. Right, that all looks nice and clean. That's where the fuel comes in. There's my butterfly. There's going to be a spring and a throttle stop screw on that. There is also going to be a mixture. All these things make tiny adjustments. There's only two things you can really adjust in the carburetor: the amount of air going in and the amount of fuel going in, all of which is done with these little screw adjusters. If you get it roughly right, it will run. If you get it exactly right, it will run rather beautifully. Oof. never be tempted to clean these things out with a bit of wire or anything like that, because I know it sounds ridiculous, but you will enlarge that hole. These are only brass. You will enlarge the hole very slightly, and very slightly, I mean 1/10 of a millimetre, 5/100ths of a millimetre. That's enough to muck up the settings. So don't do it. Right, we are getting very, very close to completing the engine. I'm going to put this governor on. Now, this is something you do need it on a lawnmower, so that if you crack the throttle open in a moment of sort of lawn mowing red mist, the thing doesn't run away with you. It sort of partly shuts the throttle again to stop it going completely mad. I'll show you how it works when we've got it together, because it's a little bit baffling, and you have to put it together in the right order. You see, I'm already thinking the best thing to do would be to install this spring first. This, hang on, that way. It's quite elegant when you see it all together. We insert that end of the rod. There you go. Oh, that was nice. Did you hear that? Okay, so when the flywheel's turning, these little vanes create a little draft, a little vortex, which will press on this and shut the throttle off again slightly. But to make sure it doesn't just flap around madly, you have this device, this little plate up here, through which the throttle cable will run when the whole thing's assembled. But this also attaches to this spring. So this bit goes on that little threaded pin there, and the throttle cable will go through here, which is all part of the system. That'll go on later, but for now we put on a washer and a nylock nut. This nut is an unusual size, not the same size as any of the spanners I have here, or indeed any of the sockets, which would mean normally you might resort to the adjustable spanner, the screw adjustable spanner like this. And the interesting thing about the adjustable spanner, it was invented by Edwin Budding, who also invented the lawnmower. The only problem is I hate adjustable spanners because I think they are the tool of the charlatan. And as luck would have it, Rebecca, who's our other camera person, not Sean, the fat Australian one, she's the nice one, carries this bicycle spanner around with her in case her bicycle goes wrong, and one end of it just happens to fit this nut perfectly. Very clever. Pure mechanics, see? Springs and rods. I love it.
We have now spent 6 hours and 1 minute reassembling nearly 200 of the 331 pieces that make up our mower. And with the attachment of the carburetor and the governor, the engine is tantalisingly close to completion.
Right, I reckon we can put the cowl and the tank and so on onto the engine, which is nice because it will suddenly become a riot of colour. All these bits are red. Okay. Doesn't that look brilliant? If you're still watching. It's hard to imagine. Do you think this has ever happened on television before? I mean, I know there have been some catastrophically unpopular programmes over the years. I mean, anything made by Richard Hammond, obviously. But has it ever got to the point where the only person still interested in what's happening is the person who's on the telly? So there's nobody actually watching it. It's a bit like a tree falling in the woods. If a man is on the television talking about a lawnmower, but nobody sees it, does it actually happen? Who knows?
Assuming this is actually happening, I carry on and get the pieces for the recoil starter mechanism.
Do keep up. Right, now we've got to assemble this spring arrangement, which I think, I've never done this either. I think this could be slightly dicey, because this spring, look at the size of the spring, and it has to go in there. Okay, so the great thing about this is it's a recoil starter, as it's known. Earlier pull start engines just had a piece of string that you had to manually wind around a thing, a little bit like that, and then you pulled it, and if it didn't start, you had to wind it up again. The advantage of this one is this spring will return it. That's if we get it in. This spring will return it to first position. Right, nobody go anywhere near that. Okay, now that will go in there. I have to drop it all in very carefully and not let it fly apart. he's done it.
And for the first time in my life, I attach a recoil starter mechanism to a 1959 Suffolk Colt 4-stroke petrol lawnmower engine.
I will go to bed tonight with a sense of deep peace, and when I wake up in the morning, I will suddenly think, I put a lawnmower engine together yesterday, and that matters. It's a sort of muse. The Greeks didn't have the lawnmower engine. They had Melpomene, but I have that. Now to build the rest of the lawnmower.
Now I will attach the air filter.
The point of that, it's very simple in the case of this engine. It's just a piece of foam rubber, but it traps things like grit and dust and grass, especially in the case of a lawnmower, so that they don't get sucked through the carburetor and possibly into the engine, where they would do enormous damage. It's another thing that should be taken out and cleaned or replaced quite regularly, but you can be pretty sure that on most lawnmowers, the one that was put in when it was new is still in there half a century later. That looks pretty good. Spark plug and spark plug cap. Well, the point of the spark plug is to make a spark, which is what ignites the mixture inside the cylinder. What essentially happens in the magneto is, by making field lines in coils collapse, don't get too worried about it, you get a very, very high voltage current, very briefly, flying down here, so that it arcs from there to that part, which is connected to effectively earth, the case of the engine. It's like it's a miniature bolt of lightning. That's a good way of thinking of it. And that's how you stop it, because that shorts out the core of the spark plug to the earth, i.e. the engine case. I remember the one we had when I was a kid, stopping it like this. I used to do it with my foot normally, and eventually the little rubber bit wore away because it was so old, and I put my finger down and did that, but of course I got an immediate high tension shock from the spark plug straight up my arm, and at the age of 12 or whatever I was, it was the end of the world. Whereas these days, at the age of 53, it would actually kill me. Now, this is the throttle cable. And the clever thing about the lawnmower, it's not really something I've ever thought about before, is instead of the cable acting directly on the butterfly there, it acts on this device we saw earlier, which is the governor. So when you pull the throttle, it will open the butterfly like that, and brum, lots of power, lots of fuel going in, but then the governor and the breeze, you remember, from the vanes underneath this cover, will shut it off again a bit so that it runs nice and smoothly. We love that. Let's just take a moment quietly to contemplate that.
It's taken me 7 hours and 39 minutes, but I've reassembled an entire lawnmower engine. And now there's no holding me back.
Right, that's that finished. That's an internal combustion engine, one of two things that, to my mind, defined the 20th century, that and the microprocessor. So, right, let's put together the, what should we call it? The chassis? Is that a good word for a lawnmower? We need this, cast iron, lovely. We need these four. You might think I'm doing this thinking, oh, will he get it right? But this is genuine. I don't know, and it's not clear. I'll just, so that you know, and I'm not sure you've seen this properly yet, this is all I have to work from. 1950s exploded diagram. It's not like in the modern world where they very helpfully do it in stages so that a numpty can do it. Here it is the whole lawnmower, 1/100th of a second after a bomb went off in the middle of it. The other thing we have to be careful of here is not putting the other end on until we've got everything on that needs to be in between the two ends, the two sides, I mean. What should we call these? These are, actually, let's see what they call them. Here's a bit of education for you. Guess what it's called, the plate that goes at the side of a lawnmower? It's called You might want to make a note of this. The side plate. Okay, right, now that at the bottom is a very significant piece. I think that would be called the sole plate. Oh, yes! Which is the equivalent of the bit on the bottom of a plane where the blade rests. So, what on earth is that? So, I will need that bearing block, bearing itself, spring, lovely. This I need. Right, we're not actually going to need that bit for a moment, but we'll put it there because it looks nice. That's what actually makes it a lawnmower rather than just something else. Putting things together is good for the soul. All other cares flee. Done, 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 done. So I shall offer up the cutter and see what it looks. This is a defining moment. At the moment, that is some green painted cast iron and steel, but as soon as I do that, you know, do you not? Aha! It's a lawnmower. And do we know it's a lawnmower because it's red and green, or because it looks like a lawnmower? If I painted that yellow and blue, you might, for a few seconds, be confused. It is ingrained in us that a lawnmower should be red and green for some reason. I don't know why. I presume because it's green because that's the colour of the grass, so it's sympathetic to the environment, and red because that's the dangerous bit, and red is for danger. I don't know, it's a theory. Oh, I need to put the roller in, don't I? Oh. Sorry, I thought that would be really heavy. This was made of tin. Now, the roller actually has two purposes here. One is it's effectively like wheels, so that the lawnmower rolls along, because if you didn't have it, you would just churn your garden up. But the other is it does roll the grass in one direction or the other, which is why a lawnmower like this gives you stripes. And everybody's absolutely obsessed with the idea that gardens must be stripy. People say, oh, grass was lovely, it was stripy. I'm not a massive fan of stripes outside of things like football pitches and so on. I think if you have stripes on a small lawn on your urban house, you look a bit of a plonker, because what are you trying to say? Yes, here's my garden. Later on, we'll be having the Super Bowl. Well, you're not going to, are you? Because it's only 10 feet long. So, but anyway, people love stripes. That will give you stripes. A proper lawnmower, as this would be called by the lawnmower enthusiasts, actually slices your grass. It doesn't chop it like a rotary mower would. In some ways, a rotary mower is a bit like an upside-down helicopter. You have the same problem of the advancing blade and the retreating blade at any one time. And helicopters, as we know, are like women as far as men are concerned, because, as a friend of mine said, you know they work and you trust them, but if you make any effort to understand them whatsoever, you'd be too terrified to go near them.
My lawnmower felt reassuringly heavy as the second cast iron side plate was fitted. Piece by piece, bit by bit, it was all coming together.
Do you know what? I've got to be brutally honest. I would say I've got that in back to front, and the long thread should be at that end. Look how much spare thread I've got on that end, and look how little I have on that end. It's not right, is it? Why the bloody hell didn't you say so when I was doing it then? Can I just split those enough to get that out without having to take the whole thing apart again? See, the problem gets worse now because there's more thread to get. I'm just wrong, aren't I? Let's face it, I'm wrong. No, it's all come apart. What do you think? And if I turn it to there, we're ready to contemplate this bit. And it has the screw on here, which all sounds simple enough, and is, you can see, slots for doing at the screws. That's about as tight as I can go before it slips out. Oh, look at that. Can you see? Look at the blade skimming along there. You can see now how it works like a pair of scissors. According to some 19th century advice, the keenness of the cut on this was such that it would trim a gentleman's business card. So, if the makers of this thing are to be believed, this being my 19th century gentleman's business card, that will cut that. How brilliant is that? I love the smell of freshly cut paper. It makes me think of spring. I love that. Right, let's go and get some clutch bits. This bit goes on the engine, the bit with the expanding shoes. Where's he gone?
Me.
All right. Oh. The bit with the expanding shoes that make the thing engage, that goes on the spinning engine side. The passive side of it, if you like, is the chassis side, which is those two bits, this bearing cover, the sprocket for the other end, which will have the chain on it. I do need that nut, and I do need that little washer and those two washers. I need those three screws to hold that plate on. I don't need that because that's the engine side. The key's the engine side. The springs are in the little shoes. That's it. Let's go. That face, I would say, goes inwards. Do we like that? I do. You should have a sleeve. Okay, let's put on the chains and the drives to the roller. Lovely. This is going to be quite a complicated bit. This is the dual drive system, the sprockets and the chains. Let's just concentrate on all the sprockets first. So we've got a big un, a little un, and what I suppose we can call a pinion. 2 mils pins. Gear stuff. We'll worry about the chains in a minute. As I lay these out on my much diminished piece of paper, half of which has been chopped up by the lawnmower in experimental work. Now, this is actually a legitimate use of a hammer. Okay, then the small sprocket on the top. I can apply the spanner to the nut and tighten it up whilst holding on to the blade so that as it becomes tight and the force of me turning this spanner rotates the blade, I can take all my fingers off in one easy, economical movement.
It was now 9 hours and 50 minutes since I began reassembling. I've built the engine, added the cowl and fuel tank, attached the blades and rear roller, and assembled the chassis. Once the chains and sprockets are on, the transmission is complete. We are getting close to mounting the engine on the lawnmower.
Let's set it back down on its roller so that we can see it properly. It is quite heavy because it's made of cast iron, obviously, in the 1950s. But you have to remember that this was actually the acceptably convenient size and weight of the lawnmower, because the very first lawnmowers were so massive they needed 2 men from the working classes to haul them along and another man just to steer it, and then later they were hauled by ponies or horses, and horses were given special shoes so that they didn't damage the ground that they were going across the cricket pitch or whatever. And sometimes they use camels, because camels' hooves have evolved not to sink into the ground, because obviously they normally walk on sand, not on people's expensive lawns. You could have two classes of shoe. I think you could have a first and second class shoe for your horse to spread the load. It's all part of the class war. If you were poor, you could only afford the second class shoe, and your lawn looked a little bit cack as a result. If you were posh, you had the first class shoe, then your lawn looked wonderful to remind the neighbours that you were just a better person. Yeah, look at that. The parts of the centrifugal clutch, stroke, brackets, engine side. Which, look how this pile of bits has diminished. This is fantastic. Right, this is going to be fiddly. It's a fantastic machine, this, in many ways, because it's absolutely rammed with small adjustments. Height of the roller, height of the blade, clutches to engage different bits, little things to adjust the tension of springs in the centrifugal clutch. It's amazing. And this is a simple lawnmower, remember. This was considered the sort of the cheap everyman version. This is as basic as a lawnmower could be. It's a sort of like, in some ways like a VW Beetle of lawnmowers, only not as awful. This half of the clutch, this is mounted to the engine. As the engine spins, centrifugal or centripetal, if you want to be pedantic, force will force those out against the springs, and then the friction surface there will lock onto the inside of that and start it spinning. But as the engine slows down, as you throttle back, the springs will take over, move the shoes in again, and then it will be disengaged because it fits in there loosely, you see? When the shoes are retracted, that's free to spin. It's been used on all sorts of things. It's used on very basic mopeds. It's used on lots of things like lawn mowers. What else uses centrifugal clutches? Let me think. Loads of things. Right. Engine. Look at that. How lawnmowery does that look? Suddenly this is, after being what seems like half my life as a collection of vaguely lawnmowery bits, this has now suddenly become a lawnmower. This is deeply, deeply exciting, because once this bit is on, we can fit the handle. The handle. Putting the handle on is a very exciting moment, but I haven't actually contemplated it yet because I need to stand back and see what it looks like with the handle on. So, hang on, let me just tighten it up, then I can enjoy that moment. Oh, yeah.
The lawnmower is almost complete. As I attach the throttle lever, it's become apparent how 10 hours can fly by when all you have to do is slowly reassemble a Suffolk Colt 1959 12-inch 4-stroke petrol lawnmower from its 331 component parts. But all of this will have been for nothing if it doesn't actually start.
There is just one component left. This one. It's the grass box. When this is on, it becomes a complete and utter lawnmower. There. That's perfect. That's fabulous. Let's see if it works. You join us at a very exciting moment outside the workshop, where we're about to find out if the freshly reassembled 1959 lawnmower will start. And this is for real. We haven't tested it in secret. There hasn't actually been any petrol in it until now. Let's find out. OK, petrol on. Choke on. Carburetor tickled. Throttle set. You ready? Oh. works. It's a lawnmower. Has anybody got a lawn? Back in 1957, this was as smart as a telephone could be, and it could do just two things. You could dial a number with it, or if somebody dialed you, it would ring. Nevertheless, this was a high watermark in the development of the telephone because it was the first GPO British Bakelite domestic telephone with a bell enclosed in the case.
This phone has 211 separate tiny parts, every single one designed with an engineering eye for detail that is staggering. We've sent people to the moon in equipment that has been less well engineered. Actually, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but this is nanotechnology 1950s style. However, in this form, it resembles the most mind-bending Meccano set on the planet.
First, we shall assemble the receiver. The bits are going to go in this plastic pot because they're all very small and very easily lost. Come and just have a quick look at these. These are tiny, tiny bits that I'm going to have to put together. Look at the size of that bit. See? Now, I've got to be honest, I'm slightly out of my comfort zone because I've never done something like a telephone before, and I don't have an exploded diagram. All I have is a circuit diagram. That's it. The rest of it is all down to instinct, luck, who knows. So that's the speaky into bit, so that must go on that end, obviously once you've put the innards in.
The receiver is also a transmitter. It uses electromagnetism to convert sound waves into a signal that can be transmitted to the person we're talking to, and vice versa.
I want to show you an amazing tool I've been lent. Look at this. It's a screwdriver with a sleeve on it, and when you slide the sleeve along, the end of the screwdriver becomes slightly smaller, but it's not quite that simple because if you look lengthways down it, there are two separate overlapping blades, and what this means is, the trouble with trying to do with little screws is they fall off the end of the screwdriver and your fingers are too big to hold on to them, so that will just drop off. But if you put it on there and slide that along, the two blades slide together, become very, very slightly thicker, and then hold the screw on. Look at that. That is the most brilliant screwdriver I've ever seen in my life. We'll come up with a way of nicking it later. So having tightened that, if I retract the sleeve, the screwdriver comes out. That is absolutely fabulous. So one of those contacts in the bottom is linked somehow to the top. And those screws are the right length to hold that in place, I would say. I'm going to make an executive decision on that and put those in using the vintage, rather lovely actually, GPO screwdriver. Where does that go? That fits there, and I would imagine this is designed to some extent to stop the wires being pulled off if somebody tugs on the receiver. It's a little bit like a sort of cable clamp. Also, the two holes in the plate line up with the two holes in the Bakelite inside the receiver. Yes, yes. Right, interesting. I'm finding it quite interesting. Right, that positions there quite nicely. Screws in thus.
Now for some wires.
Brown. There are different colours in the receiver from the ones that are in the chassis of the thing, which we're going to come on to later. Now, I've worked out from the wiring diagram, red, green and white are the three colours going to what would appear to be the receiver. Red, green and white are what I have on ye olde, what do you call this bit on a telephone? What do you call this bit?
Cord.
The cord, yes, thank you. Now, that must go through that special magic screwdriver into there. That isn't quite in the clamp. Ah, that goes over. Ah, yes, yes. That's brilliant. Look, that's a loop in the cord. Can you just see it starting to poke its little head up there? And that hooks over that little bit on the plate so that if somebody dropped the receiver or tugged on it, it wouldn't pull the wires out of the connectors or pull the joins apart. It would simply pull on that. And I just have to find a means. Neldy nose pliers. Like so. Tug on that to your heart's content. Right, the diaphragm piece, slide gently sideways. The diaphragm is a very simplified version of the cone in the speaker of your home hi-fi. It simply vibrates and moves a greater volume of air, so it makes more sound. Sound being just the air moving backwards and forwards. That should screw on there. Just before I put it in, this bit, which is the bit you speak into, the microphone, if you like, if you shake it, you can hear, I'll shake it right next to the microphone. Can you hear that little noise? Can you hear that sounds department? That is the sound of carbon granules inside there. It's a way of making your voice clearer because your voice vibrates the diaphragm behind there. That compresses and rarefies the mass of carbon crystals. That changes their resistance, which then gives you a clearer, better defined signal travelling down the wire to the person at the other end, and it will go in his or her ear there. Now that rests on a pin there. It's not hardwired in, it sits on a pin which makes contact, but that's so that you can easily take it out and replace it, because these would wear out, the carbon would become all clumped together, especially in houses in the 1950s, because they'd have been horribly damp. Now that's got to go to there, so clonk, clonk. Hello, caller. There you go.
We are 44 minutes into our attempt to reassemble our 1957 Bakelite telephone with an internal cased bell, and we've a completed receiver. The intricacies of the receiver, however, are nothing compared with the next familiar part we have to rebuild, the dial.
Now returning to the fantastic sweet shop of telephone componentry with my special little pot, and I'm going to take the components for the dial plate, that brass backing piece, and two tiny, tiny little screws. That's not a great deal of stuff, but I think it's going to be quite fiddly to put together, so let's not be over-ambitious. The reason I wanted to make a bit of a thing about the dial plate, to be honest, is because those of us over a certain age, I hate having to admit to this because it does make me sound very old, but we do remember a time when most of us did spend our lives dialing by putting our fingers in holes, turning the dial and letting it go back to the beginning. So there you go. The holes, I remember this, actually. It's a long time since I've used a telephone with a dial on it, but when the telephone was invented, I mean, the dial goes back to, I think, the 19th century. I don't think the dimensions of it changed since then, but people who were undernourished back then didn't have such big fingers. The holes were always slightly too small. You could get through, say you had a reasonably big number with about 8 or 10 digits in it, you could get most of the way through it, and then your finger would slip out and it would go bzzz back to the beginning. You'd think, oh, cock, you know, you'd have to put the receiver down and start again. You know, you had to make sure you'd been to the lavatory before you used the telephone because you could be caught short halfway through your number. It just took forever. I am starving, but once this is back together, I can ring up for a pizza. Well, I didn't have pizza in those days, did they? I'd have rung up for some boiled beef and carrots. So
Not actually building a time machine.
Well, you sort of are. You say that. If we get this thing working, I'll probably be able to speak to my departed ancestors on it. It's one of the things I always used to find very creepy about telephones when I was a child, because I thought everything that had ever been said in them was still in them. So I couldn't understand how all those people fitted in the television either. I was only about 3. Let's go and collect some more components. I think we'll do the other side of the dial, which starts to get very tricky. God, I'm going to continue my tireless work on the dial, which will involve this large plate onto which everything goes one way or another, I think. These lovely little brass bits. Everything is very beautifully made in this, it must be said. A spring. I think that should do us for several hours, I should think.
The first challenge is to build the mechanism that controls the dial.
That's a cheese head screw, parallel-sided. It's got like a wheel of cheese shape on the top, and that hole there is quite clearly made to accommodate that. So that's a bit of a clue to start with. And that diameter quite clearly passes through that one. I must say that this thing is very much of its type. It's very, very old-fashioned, but it is exquisitely made. These telephones must have cost a fortune. Although, of course, you didn't buy a telephone in the olden days. It always belonged to the government, effectively. You rented the telephone, you had line rental, and that included the telephone. The telephone, I remember in a flat I used to own, which I'd bought from some very old people, the telephone was hardwired into the wall. There was none of this pulling the plug out and moving it around. And in fact, technically, you weren't allowed to unwire it yourself. You had to call a man from the post office to come and do it. Not by the time I got there, because, you know, that was in the 90s, but they would have done. What the hell are you going on about, mate? Just shut up and put the telephone together. Right, so the spring, I do like a good spring. That's a lovely spring. This is working. It's quite pleasurable watching the spring diminish in size but increase in potential energy because it's being wound up. But it does mean that the risk at the same time is also increasing, that I will lose concentration for a millionth of a second, and the noise you will hear will be bang. That's all you will hear, and then there will be nothing there. This will be a quantum event. There will be a spring there, and then there won't be a spring there. There will be no discernible spring making its way from here to over there. It'll just be bang, and it won't be there anymore. I've done it. That spring will go in there. It'll stay in there forever now, coiled in the darkness, waiting to respond to the eager fingers of young lovers and businessmen trying to close deals. I am just a spring, but I'm here to serve you by returning that dial to the beginning so you can put another number in. So if I hold that with my fingers and they line up, it's extremely nicely made to very close tolerances, but it would have to be, wouldn't it? I haven't got the nut on the other end, but you can already see that's ready to return. It's exciting, isn't it? And now that, but I'm not sure how I know what position that should go in. Maybe it doesn't matter. Well, it can't matter, because otherwise, I can tell by the way this thing is made. If it did matter, they would have made sure I got it in the right position. That's what the Japanese would call poka-yoke, i.e. foolproofing, making sure something will only go together the right way. But it wasn't a completely new idea. There's a little bit of it in here. So I've got 2 nuts. I'm guessing one is a nut to get it nicely snuggled down, and the other one is a locking nut to go on the top. It's really difficult when you... See? We're somewhere close to a dial. It's not doing the digger bit yet because we don't have the mechanisms in place to make the little pulses. So look, that, I'm not actually even sure what this bit is called, but that rubbery bit obviously interacts in some way with those slots, I would say, because it's the right size too. That end will go into a hole to locate that end, and the screw goes through that end. So I'm looking for a threaded hole of that size, that distance, from there to there, from a hole that would obviously locate that. So, thus. So that is free to pivot. Watch the little rubber bit. As I dial, then as that comes back, there's something to do with the pulsing because it's got a slot for every number. Right, should we get some more bits?
We are 1 hour and 32 minutes into the reassembly. And as well as the receiver and the face of the dial itself, half the mechanism that controls it has been built, including the spring that ensures the dial snaps back into position when being used. But now it's time to delve into the dark mechanical secrets that lurk behind the innocent dial of the antique telephone.
Now this, I know because I've seen something like this before. This is it's a governor. It's going to slow down the dial as it goes back, because that will spin very, very quickly. Those two weights will be thrown out and will rub on the inside of that little cylinder. And that will retard, I imagine, the return of the dial. We would take the governor and the governor, I don't know what you actually call that, I'm going to call it the governor pot, and offer that up to the bearing. Offer it up is one of those things you see in old instruction manuals and technical books. Offer it up means line it up with and get it roughly in the right position. But where's the camera gone? Oh, yeah. Get it roughly in the right position, but we're not talking about anything permanent yet. It's an offer. It is just an offer. It's not a contract. You offer it up, and then you sign the contract with the screws or whatever holds it permanently in place. So I will offer it up to the camera. Here's our little governor, whizzy round and round. That would eventually be engaged with the, I don't really want to call them the teeth. They're more like pallets on the bottom of that fibre arrangement. Now, having offered that up, I'm going to offer up the little screws and washers that hold that plate in place. Smashing. It is rather beautiful, it must be said. There's a little clutch inside that fibre wheel arrangement. That's fantastic, isn't it? Let's consider all the bits left over. Yeah, this is a fabulous moment. I can put this on, but how? I hear you cry as one. I've got it, I've got it. That has to go there because the two screws that hold the finger stop in place also trap that. Does that sound believable? So young people observe, in the olden days, our telephone number at home was 01709373323. So let's dial that. 017093732. 3. That's one number. I mean, it's just agony. And often, sometimes, it'd be a bit like filling up the car with petrol. You'd think, I'll ring Cookie. I wonder if he wants to come out to the pub. I'll ring... Oh, I can't be bothered. You'd give up. See, the numbers got gradually bigger over the years because they had to add an extra number to the number for the house, then an extra number to the code, and then another extra number to the code, because nobody ever anticipated how many telephones there would be, and they're still getting it wrong with mobile phones. But then again, when the telephone was a new invention, Graham Bell said it was such a good idea that eventually every town would have one. I'm not a believer that the olden days were better than the modern world. I think it's complete nonsense. There are only 2 things I've ever identified that genuinely were better in the past, and those are electric kettles, because they just break after 15 minutes these days, and American pickup trucks, which were better looking in the 70s. But something else, I may have to admit, something that was consistently of extremely high quality, was small fixings. These things are just, they're absolutely gorgeous. They're beautifully made.
2 hours and 49 minutes in, and I have reassembled the receiver and the dial. That's the mouth, ears, and heart of the phone.
But now we're going to look at the brains of the machine. That is the chassis. This is where all the electrical shenanigans goes on, and where the telephone is made to live, if you like, where its soul dwells. If René Descartes had anything to do with telephones, he would have said this was its what's-it gland. Right. Now, it is time for a little bit of a confession, because all those bits that I've just collected, this is actually only half of the story. We have this going here, there's that to go inside some wires, this bit, this, which goes up here and will eventually be screwed on, and capacitors and little transformers and all the rest of it. But the honest truth is, there is also a huge amount of wiring that's all bundled up under there, lots and lots of minute soldering. It's reckoned by the telephone experts that I've talked to that the process of putting this together could take up to 2 days. So, for the first and only time in this series, possibly even in my life, I'm able to say, here's one we prepared earlier. And I'd just like to point out, I believe I could do this, of course, but no one else is prepared to let me try. There's a huge amount, look at that under there. This is what the world was like before we had microprocessors. Every single connection, every little on and off was a separate wire, a separate switch, an actual physical thing. That's what all that is. And this is just one telephone, and all this telephone does is dial numbers. That's all it does. Let's get some more bits. Some of you will be saying, I wish they'd do the whole series like that. I know, but tough luck. This table of components is a bit like one of those bowls of pasta that you keep eating for about half an hour, but it doesn't actually get any smaller. You know the sort of thing I mean. We need those. I think I need that and those 2 little screws. I need those 2. I don't need those. I do need that. And I need all of those except that. Still just as big as it was. I suppose the first bit of this is mildly exciting because it involves the setup of the bell, the voice of the telephone rather than the voice of the person on the telephone. This little block has a screw that goes in it, which I think is that one. Yes, it is. Just put that in loosely for the moment. And one of these passes through each of those holes. Being very careful as you move these things around, not to knacker any of the soldered connections. If I get this the wrong way round, which I'm not planning on doing, but if I do, the Actually, the bell won't ring, so you won't know if anybody's ringing you up. I suppose would defeat the whole point of having a telephone. That eventually is, that's the clapper. So eventually that will be made to vibrate like that, and it will strike the two bells. The bells aren't going in yet. That unalloyed pleasure is yet to be yours, watching the bells go in. Now, I think probably those two nuts aren't tight yet, neither is that screw, which is effectively a clamp for that bit, but I think first I will secure that whole assembly to the chassis with these two very nice shiny little chassis screws, and then I'll give it a bit of a jiggle and make sure everything is good. Did that in the wrong order, should have put a screw on the end of a magic screwdriver first, but I think it may be possible to do it one-handed. It is. There, that's looking quite good. Tight, tight. Dring, 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 dring. Right, should we do some more? Now we shall attach the dial cord, which is that bit, plus the dial cord fixing screws and so on, but never mind that. Most excitingly, we can fit the bells. Now, it's interesting that the two bells, I wonder if I can demonstrate this, are slightly different, because that's what gives a British telephone its characteristic, rather warm and unaggressive ring. Also, we have the rhythm dring, 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 whereas the Americans, you'll know this from films, have dring, dring. The British ring is better, obviously. This is weird. I haven't heard those two tones for many, many years, but it does take me back. A bit like meeting a kid with mumps.
And while you reminisce about mid-20th century childhood ailments, I have a dial cord to attach.
Beautiful. Right, now, the modern line. This is the bridge between the world of the 1950s, when people said Whitehall 1212, and the modern world, when people go, hey, when they answer the telephone. This connects to the old tech here and to the modern world at that end. So this is sort of the cable of time travel. Well, it's slightly clumsy, but obviously this board wasn't originally designed to take that shape connector, but I think we'll get away with it. You won't be able to see it. But finally, do you remember what we saw in the receiver many, many, many hours ago about how there was a nice little loop in the fabric of the cord in order to secure it and make sure that the connections couldn't be pulled apart? There's something very similar here. There's two free ends which you simply tie around these chassis posts. Silence. So that once again, any tugging on the telephone or tugging on the receiver isn't going to pull all the wires apart. Left and under. There you go. With enough cord left that you'll be able to untie it next time somebody wants to take this to bits. Marvellous. What you're actually looking at there is a telephone. That is all the functioning stuff. It just doesn't look like a telephone yet because It's not in a telephone case. And let's not forget, this was the first GPO British domestic provided Bakelite telephone with an internal bell. So let's internalise the bell. Out of habit, I've brought my little sweet box thing along, but actually, all I'm looking for is the two little, I don't even know what they're called, the little plungy blip, blip, blip things, and the, there you go. So these two pieces are the things that you tap down upon. They will be spring-loaded when they're in the whole assembly, and they stick out of there. So when you can't, you go, operator, operator, and tap on those. That's what we're looking at. I'm not entirely sure how they go together, but let's... So that size in there, so I'm guessing that would go through there, and then you would put the nut on from the other side, and then when they're under spring tension, they will pop up. I've got to admit to being slightly conflicted about this whole thing, because one part of me really likes putting things together and mending things. If I see a bicycle with a puncture, or, you know, a badly crashed Hornby train or something like that, I have a desperate urge to save it. But another part of me thinks that all things from the past should just be thrown away because it's over. Even though I react to a thing like a telephone in bits the way I do when I see one of those appeals to save a sad donkey on one of those charity things. But on the other hand, you have to remember that this is from the 50s, and, I don't know, declarations of love would have been made down this thing by people who have since turned to dust. So it's a bit haunted. You imagine that, I know your wife's going to find out, but I love you. He's dead. So's she, so's the wife. None of it matters. The poet Larkin said that the only thing that would survive of us is love, but actually he was wrong. It's the Bakelite telephone, who survived the nuclear winter. So I forgot my sweet pot.
We're 4 hours and 41 minutes into the build, and a phone is starting to emerge. There's a receiver, a dial complete with mechanism, electrics, bell and case. Marvellous.
Yeah. Now, what I'll do next is put the dial on, and in fact I need to go back to my table of pieces to get the 5 tiny little screws that hold that together. Right, it's those ones. Tiny, tiny little screws. They will attach the wires that run from the chassis up to the dial. 5 of them. They're nice little screws, I'll give them that. I'm going to have to look at the wiring diagram to remember the order in which those wires connect to the tiny little contacts on the back of the dial, and the order goes orange, pink, brown, slate grey, blue. Orange, pink, brown, slate grey, blue. That's exactly what we've got. Now, these are some of the smallest screws in the telephone. Look. Tiny little screw. And screw is a remarkable thing, actually, isn't it? Should we think about screws for a minute? The thread form. That goes all the way back to Archimedes. But it's one of those things we haven't managed to shake off. We still depend on them. We don't use them in this sort of application anymore. If you look at a telephone from, say, the 1980s, the wires are attached with little jaws that automatically strip them and clamp them as you push them in, so you don't have to fiddle around with small screws anymore. And obviously in something like a smartphone, then it's all plug-in modules. There are no screws involved. So that is a massive component by modern standards, but it's a tiny one by the standards of the age when this telephone was made. But think of all the things that screws do. They attach things together, they make things move in proportion. Shall I put them in?
It's only now, after 5 hours, that the 211 separate, mostly minuscule components that I started with have turned into something reassuringly phone-shaped.
Quite satisfying, I'll be honest. I find that many of the troubles of the world disappear as I do up a very, very small screw. There you are, you see, for 5 glorious, blissful minutes while I did that, I'd completely forgotten that my missus left me last night. She hasn't actually, but, I mean, I'm always slightly surprised when she's still there. Now this, I think, if I've got this right, these two little, I'm not even sure what I would call those. Are they tabs? They will go through those slight cutouts in the Bakelite, and then I will give it a little bit of a turn, and that will lock it in place behind that edge, and I will put the screw in, the awkward screw from the bottom, and that will be the dial in. Yeah, you see, that's locked into place, but we've got to put that little screw in. Right, I'm expected to get a screw. That's very awkward. A magic screwdriver may not help me here. It's very dark inside the 1950s. Hang on, I need a torch. Ah, there you go. Oh, Mistress Irony. See, imagine if you'd approached Alexander Graham Bell and said, your telephone's brilliant, mate, but I think it needs a torch on it. I mean, people would have said you were mad. I need a method of sort of... That doesn't work. How long are you going to watch me doing this before somebody says, shall I come and hold that torch for you?
We've got all those bits.
I can hold it.
Brilliant. So you've got all those shots.
So I need to get the magic screwdriver back in the slot back, so...
Do you want me to come and hold the torch? Yeah, sure. Careful, it's on contact, she might ring someone.
There's no part there in the lawnmower, it's a three-man job.
It needs a sort of hole there to... Up a bit with the torch, please. That's it. That's a proper screwdriver. Ta-da! Yeah, German. Thank you. Right. I think we're in the position, we're very, very close to telephone closure here. We can put the base on and then insert the little slidey out tray that has the numbers for the Prime Minister and so on it. Let's go and get those bits. Probably don't need that. I think first, actually, we'll put together the little drawer in the bottom that has the handy telephone numbers on it, because you don't get that with telephones anymore. The phone numbers are inside it, if they're anywhere. That's the handle, that's the finishing strip, and those are the two itty-bitty screws. Okay. Here is the sheet of the handy numbers. Oh, it's a BBC telephone. I hadn't looked at that. Broadcasting House, Kensington House, Riverside Studios, 86764. This was probably still in service last week. Local calls, 9, followed by the number required. Oh, it actually goes in there. OK, so there's two screws, and there's a small handle. It goes on the front, and then that, which I'm imagining, is a finisher, which would go like that. PTO. Now this is exciting. Are you watching this? The little card of all the numbers you'll ever need slides inside that thing like that. And then you can lift it up. That's why the other side is printed the other way up, you see. Look at that. There's a huge amount of thought gone into this. It's even got those two little spring-loaded things that mean this will slide in and it will make a satisfying boop, and then it won't come out again. You'll pull it, but it will stop, a bit like a kitchen drawer. Right, we're very, very close to the end. Just moment of reorganisation. Now we're going to get the base, screw it on, insert the drawer, and then the telephone is complete and we can put the receiver on its cradle. Are we ready for this? Do you want to take a few moments to compose yourselves and maybe go to the lavatory and pour another drink? So those are the feet. And then the base itself. And I've just noticed, I don't know why I didn't see this before, but there's a much, much better wiring diagram for the telephone actually on the telephone. It's much clearer. Yeah, it just makes perfect sense. Nipping up. Now we're almost there, but that has to go on.
After 6 hours and 37 minutes, this reassembly is almost finished. The 1957 GPO Bakelite telephone with internal bell will soon be complete. Stand by, caller.
Now, I've got a little bit of telephone trivia for you, if you're interested, about the 999 emergency number, which is written on this little piece of cardboard that goes on the front of the dial. And the reason it's 999 is not, as a lot of people imagine, because in the dark you can put your 2 fingers in the dial and find the 9. That's a silly theory, because you could just as easily find the 0. The reason is the telephone works by sending a series of pulses down the line. That's 3 pulses for the number 3. The problem with it is telephone exchanges would take a while to wake up. They couldn't wake up with just a 1. They needed a big number like 0, which is why most telephone numbers began with a 0. And that's one problem. The other problem is that the early telephone lines were suspended through the air, and if they touched each other, that sent a pulse down the line. And on windy days, they would occasionally touch, and you'd get a single pulse down the line. And there was a very good chance that you could get 3 of those in succession, which would give you 111. And if you'd made 111 the emergency dialing number, that would happen by accident all the time. By making it 999, the chances of you getting 3 bursts of 9 collisions of wires are, you know, just billions and billions to 1. So it wouldn't happen accidentally. That is why we have 999 as the emergency number. Here is the small piece of, I imagine that's cellulose acetate or something like that, with its locating pin at the bottom, so you can't put this perfectly blank circular piece of stuff in the wrong position. It only has a wrong position as a result of having the device to make sure you put it in the right position. The 1957 GPO supplied British domestic Bakelite telephone with an internal bell. The weird thing is that when this was new, this would have been a miracle of technology, a marvel of manufacturing because of all those small bits in it. Now it's old, the thing we like about it is the way it looks, not the way it works. Yes, it's part of the history of art and design. It is part of the history of technology as well, but old technology is useless. Old art and design is still interesting. Should we plug it in and see if it works? Now, today on the table we have the 147 components that make up an electric guitar. And as long as they stay there like that, laid out beautifully, there is no danger that anybody will attempt to play Stairway to Heaven. However, I am going to put it back together and take the risk. And we will start, even though this should normally happen in the middle of the performance, by taking it to the bridge. This is the bridge plate, there. That is the trem block, securing screws. All this will go together into a rather pleasing and shiny sub-assembly. Now, as usual on this show, I don't have an exploded diagram for the electric guitar, although I do know roughly what one looks like and how it works. So, this is the bridge. The strings go over the bridge. This is the trem block, which mounts underneath and is connected to the lever that you can pull to make it go wow, wow, wow. And these saddles allow you to minutely adjust the position of the strings relative to the neck, because the neck has a slight curve in it, so the strings in the middle have to be slightly higher than the strings at either side. This is a screw and forget sort of operation. Well, I think once I've screwed this together, it won't be unscrewed again until the guitar is completely disassembled. I'm going to tell you something absolutely fascinating. Really fascinating. This is a Japanese-made guitar. It's a replica of a Fender, but it's made by a Japanese company. And these, you would say, are Phillips screws. Agreed, because they've got a crosshead in, but they're not posi-drive because they haven't got the little indentations between the slots. However, if you look very closely, you will see, look at the top there. Can you see there is a very, very tiny center punch mark? You can see that. That means that isn't a Phillips pattern screw. It means it's JIS, or Japanese Industry Standard. And it's an important difference because the Phillips screwdriver was invented primarily for the American automotive manufacturing industry. And the point of it is that the shape is designed such that the operator didn't have to worry about exactly how tight he did the screw up. This tool could be powered and it would automatically jump out of the screw when the right torque was reached. Now, the Japanese came up with a slightly different pattern, which means that if you use a Phillips-headed screwdriver, such as this one, and a Japanese industry standard screw, you will largely get away with it, but you will also tend to chew it up because the profile of the slot is slightly different. Japanese industry standard screwdrivers are actually surprisingly difficult to get hold of in Europe. But, and how surprised will you be at this, I have 3 of them here in my toolbox because I spend quite a bit of my sad spare time fiddling around with small Japanese motorcycles from the early 1960s, which had Japanese industry standard crosshead screws in them. And if you don't have the right screwdriver, you end up chewing them up, which is why you see a lot of those old bikes with knackered screws in the crankcases. Look at that. That's a Japanese industry standard screwdriver fitting beautifully in that screw. Just out of interest, I mean, it's a small difference when you're doing this. It does make a difference with things like the cases of a motorcycle engine, but if I put it on the Phillips screwdriver, it's not quite solid. There's a bit of, can you see? It's trying to come out. Use Japanese industry standard, solid as a rock. Most people don't know that, and it is true that if you look at a lot of old Hondas and Yamahas and things from that 1960s, 70s period, they have horribly chewed up crankcase screws. The screws were rather soft anyway, the ones the Japanese made. They did that deliberately so you didn't over-tighten them. But if you combine that with the incorrectly shaped screwdriver head, you end up with stuff that you're forever having to drill out because it's been knackered by amateurs who don't understand about JIS. You know, the world is full of Philistines. These screws that secure, oh, that was risky, the saddles to the bridge plate are all of the same length. We're talking about a fine-tuning device here, but there's a spring between the screw and the saddle itself in there, and the 6 springs that I have here are of 3 different lengths. So there's 2 medium ones, 2 long ones, and 2 short ones. So the order of the springs would be going from the left, and the lowest string, short, medium, long, short, medium, long. And now I'm wondering, is it better to put the little grub screws into the saddles first? I think it probably is, if only loosely. So I'm going to do that. There are 6 strings and hence 6 saddles, but 2 grub screws in each one, so you're going to have to watch me put 12 of these in loosely, I'm afraid. That one, short grub screws, short spring. Medium spring, Becca, will you leave my toolbox alone? So we have the trem block, the bridge plate, the saddles, and the adjusting screws, and the springs. See? It's nice. Like it. Right, these are the pickups, the thing that make this an electric guitar rather than just an acoustic guitar. And obviously some screws and springs. And these mount not onto the body of the guitar, as you might imagine, but onto this, the scratch plate, along with some other things that we'll be getting later. This is the scratch plate. I'm just scratching off some of the cack that's attached to it from many years of fingers twiddling these knobs. Right, there you go. Now the pickups. Pickups are quite interesting if you're interested in that sort of thing. They are the heart of the instrument. They are what makes it an electric guitar rather than simply a guitar, an acoustic guitar. The way they work, let's see if I can find a way of making this reasonably simple. They are a magnet, or a series of magnets, with copper wire wound around them. I can demonstrate that they're magnets because that screw sticks to it. And you might remember from physics, if you ever paid attention, that if you move a wire in a magnetic field in a coil, you will get a current, an EMF. And this is really how the guitar works. The string vibrates and generates a very tiny current inside the coil. And the size of that current is dependent on the amplitude of the string's vibration, how far it moves, and the frequency, how quickly it's moving. And that is then effectively producing an electric note, which is amplified by the big stack of Marshalls. Other types of amplifier are available. And then that comes out as Motorhead or whatever. And I've got a spare coil here so that I can show you. But if I peel off the protective tape, you will see the copper coils. There are something like 6,000 turns of very fine copper wire on there. In fact, the total length of the copper wire in the three pickups is about, I did this calculation earlier on, it's about 2.6 kilometres of wire. So if you joined the three wires end to end and stretched them out, you'd be able to fill 3 double-decker buses the size of a swimming pool and the area of Wales, which would be visible from outer space. We can't use that one because I've effectively ruined it doing that. The pickups are essentially the same, but they've got different length bits of wire attached to them because they have different positions in the body of the instrument. So that's the longest one, so that will go there. The shortest one will go here. They have a cover on them. Screws will go through the scratch plate, like so. And then on the other side, there is a spring. So when you mount the pickup to the scratch plate, it goes on the screw like so, but there's the spring in between, which means that by making tiny movements of the screw, you can adjust the position of the pickup relative to the string, i.e. the height. Turn it up that way. You can see that's effectively an adjustment. Yeah?
Watching someone attach pickups to a scratch plate is like waiting for the end of a Mark Knopfler guitar solo. So let's not.
In the very early electric guitars, which were sort of prototypes really, the pickups were above the strings. They were almost like 2 horseshoe magnets. I mean, the effect was exactly the same. It's just that by putting them underneath the strings, apart from making it all much neater, it allows for these various adjustments to be made. It's just altogether neater. But the idea of electric amplification by this method has been understood since the late 19th century. The electric guitar really became quite a big thing post-World War II, and is generally credited in America, certainly, as being the thing that saved us from a plague of ukuleles, which had become a very popular instrument before that. There were ukulele bands everywhere. I mean, the idea is absolutely abominable. But thanks to enthusiasm for the electric guitar, people stopped playing the ukulele, so we can thank it for that at the very least. And yeah, it's worth pointing out as well that this is a pure electric guitar. If it's not plugged into an amplifier, you can barely hear it. It does make a noise, but it's a very faint little tinkling. You can't really play it acoustically.
After an hour and 40 minutes of exhilarating reassembly, we have attached the bridge plate and the string saddles to the trem block, and the pickups are in place. Now I need the potentiometers, the pots. These will control the guitar's tone and volume.
I'm not going to take the knobs because pushing the knobs on will be a rather joyous moment that we should save until the end. So let's take the switch assembly out and contemplate it. You can tell by the way it's joined together what the relationship is. Volume, tone, tone. The switch of the pickups in there. What I did earlier whilst we were laying the bits of the guitar out is to just open up the little tabs on this pot. This is the volume control, just so that you can see inside, get a bit of an idea how it works. Now these are off-the-shelf sort of components, these sort of things. I've got to be careful because it was already soldered together and I didn't want to break that, but there you are. You can see this slider running around. So if you imagine that the electricity, there's off, you feel the little click. Electricity comes in at one end of that strip, and as you slide the copper contact around, the amount of strip that the electricity goes through increases, so the resistance increases. So it becomes a volume switch. Does that make sense? Each switch, each pot, has two spacers on it. Keep all the soldered gubbins and so on clear of the underneath of the scratch plate and the tabs and everything else that would snag and make it sit unevenly and offend everybody's. I've put 3 on there. Failed. And then, right, we've got to line everything up here. So the switch, the tone pickup control switch will go through there, and then volume through there, and control 1 through there, and tone control 2. Get a couple of these shallow nuts on loosely, then we know it can't fall apart, then we can wave it around. And now 2 screws to secure. Interestingly, given the drivel I was talking earlier on about Japanese industry standard screws, these ones aren't. These appear to be regular Phillips pattern. Move the screwdriver with the right there. Not necessary to do this sort of thing up really ridiculously tightly. Apart from anything else, you might crack a plastic scratch plate. It's time to break out the little used and rather despicable bone spanner. Many of you will have had one of these as something that you were given with your bicycle to ensure that you could never put it back together again, because they are fairly hopeless, but it'll do for this. Right, now we're going to have to do some soldering somewhere under here. Let me just see if I can work this out. So that's volume, tone and tone. So tone would, oh God, it's electrics. Right, the pickup switch is a 3-way 5-place switch.
Which is a good thing, because the 3-way 5-place switch is my favourite kind of switch. But it's a bit of a sod to solder.
Soldering is one of those things that is technically impossible for one person to do, because anybody who does it regularly will tell you you actually need 3 arms to solder. But what I do have that helps me a bit is this. This was a birthday present a few years ago. It's a sort of soldering help kit. It has a nice pair of reverse action tweezers to hold the wires in fiddly places. You've got to be very careful as you solder onto the back of something like that, not to hold the soldering iron there for any longer than you absolutely have to. A few seconds, ideally, at the most, in fact, because otherwise you will heat that component up and then you could do some damage inside. There is, for example, a plastic piece in the middle that it rotates around. If you got that too hot, it would melt slightly, and then the whole thing would jam up. I've got to be honest, I don't particularly like soldering. I like it when it works. When it doesn't, I hate it. I am going to use my tweezers because it should mean that you can see what's happening better. Now I'm trying to get away, hang on, because that's quite a low wattage soldering iron for sort of mending toys and the like. I'm hoping to get away with just remelting the bit of old solder that's on there. It's not ideal, to be honest, but let's see. It's not going to work, is it? Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Doesn't like it, Skipper. No, that's not bad. Right, so that, let's put those to one side. I'm hoping I can make that end of that survive on that first tab there. Okay, that was pickup 1, that is pickup 2. Do we like that? There you go, there's the scratch plate complete. We've just got 2 wires left to join onto the jack plug socket, and we'll put the knobs on, but we'll do that later because that's nice. Right, tea. Right, we will take the springs, the plate, and the 2 screws required for the trem bar, and also these 6 screws which secure the bridge plate to the body, which means if I just take those over to the bench, we can come back and get, obviously the most significant bit, remove it very carefully, the body. Front, back. Right, because this is a valuable thing and very shiny, I always carry a pillowcase around with me. Whose pillowcase is this? That's disgusting. That's correct, that. I always carry an old pillowcase around with me. Right, we're going to start on the back, and we are going to fit this plate and these springs, which will connect ultimately to this. There is a wire on there which goes through there. We'll worry about that later. But that basically prevents nasty crackling noises. So the nasty crackling noise being made by the band is uncorrupted. Okay, so should we leave it at that for the moment? That leaves room for adjustment, yes? I think this probably makes sense at this point to turn the body over, put in the bridge plate, and put in the screws. The great thing about the guitar is that it's portable, obviously. It's, even if you need a small amplifier, it's reasonably self-contained. You can play the whole music on the one instrument. The downside of it is, it's one of the, they're a bit like drum kits in a way. A lot of people say they're a drummer, but what they really are is a drum kit owner, which is not the same thing. It's in the way that if I bought a Formula One car, I wouldn't be a Formula One driver, I would be a man who happens to own an old Formula One car. It's a different thing. Rebecca, is it really worth even having you here? I have put all of the screws into the bridge plate, which aren't tight. They're nipped up, but they allow a small amount of movement in that, which it needs to have, obviously, to produce the tremolo effect. I'm going to flip the body back over again. So you can have up to 5 springs on this. This guitar has 3 springs. Depends how much effect you want, what sort of player you are, and so on. I'm going to go, it's a bit of a guess really, for the middle and the 2 extreme positions. I'm also going to change my mind about that and put the spring above the wire. That's quite difficult with my gammy arm, but this being essentially a motorcycle restorer's toolbox, I have... Does anybody know what that is?
A hook.
It's technically a spring puller. It's for pulling springs, because it has a nice thin end for easing out. You can pull springs and lever springs around with a screwdriver. It's another of those many thousands of jobs to which a screwdriver can be put inappropriately, but then you often can't get it out. With a proper spring puller, such as this is, you can drop it in and then the end comes out, you see. Right, so that, I would say, looks quite promising. It still looks like a guitar, so I don't think I've messed anything up particularly. We have a choice now. We can put the neck on, which makes it a bit more unwieldy, or we can put the scratch plate on and do the last bit of wiring, but that makes it a bit more vulnerable. I think once the neck is on, it becomes a little bit Laurel and Hardy walking around with a long plank of wood type thing, you know, I'll say. And over here we see, and then the cameraman's teeth are gone, and then I can say, if you look at that end, you know, and then Rebecca's face is all smashed in, let's put the scratch plate on and do a bit of wiring. Now that's going to go there, and those wires are going to pass through that hole and be soldered on to the jack plug socket, and this wire, which is the other end of the earthing bit from the trem bar arrangement, has to be soldered onto, let's have a think about that. I'm guessing it would go on the volume pot. But that means I've got to do it like, oh, God, I hate this. Hate soldering. What's that?
Extremely necessary.
Well, I'm just cleaning up a bit where I'm going to solder it, because
That is nails on a blackboard.
is it?
It really
Yeah,
is.
it's really
Is
hard.
it? It doesn't bother me. It may be possible here. With a bit of, no, hang on. A bit of cleverness to use the special soldering tweezers as the third arm I covered for soldering, because I can, just watch me melt the finish on the guitar case doing this. I can then feed. The soldering iron isn't powerful enough, is it? Yes, it is. There you go. That's tinning. That's nice. Okay. Now, is it going to be... It's going to go... I don't want to put any strain on it, so it should be... like that, I would say. Okay, that'll do, comes the cry of the perfectionist down the ages. So what we can now do, we can feed the wires through the hole to go onto the jack socket, the thing that connects the essentially private electromagnetic activity of the guitar with the amplified world of rock and roll, making sure not to disturb any of that other extremely fragile soldering. We should be able to drop that into position. The other wires have to go through the channel in the middle, which they're not quite doing. I need a benign poking device. Big fat screwdriver. Sorry. There. That's ready to screw together.
Before I quite literally screw this up, let me remind you that in the past 3 hours and 45 minutes we have built up the scratch plate, attached the volume and tone pots, the trem block, the trem claw and springs, and prepared the jack socket for its cover. And I've done a lot of soldering. Once I've attached the scratch plate, it should all begin to look a lot more guitar-y.
What I quite like about a moment like this in the reassembly of a thing is that something that's been flapping about in a rather annoying way and in a way that offends my slight sense of order in the universe will suddenly become tight and taut and rattle-free, and, you know, it will assume some permanence. And I like that. Because I'm only putting the screws in loosely. It's still got that, you know, it's not right, it's not settled, it's not happy. And there's all that wiry stuff underneath which could become tangled and broken and trapped. Terrible things like that. I also have a bit of a phobia about wires. I can't stand looking behind my desk where all the bits from the computer go. I don't like looking behind people's TVs, because if they've got a TV and a hard disk recorder and a Sky Plus box and Apple TV, all the rest of it, he's got this massive pile of wires, and whatever you do, they always end up all knotted up, and it makes me feel... I get a sort of strange pain in my teeth when I look at things like that. Oh, God, horrible. It's generally thought that you have a very long-handled screwdriver like this because you are doing something in an inaccessible place, such as getting to the adjustment screws on the carburetor of a complicated motorcycle or a deeply buried car engine. And they are very good for that, but there's another reason for using a long screwdriver if you can, which is that obviously the purchase of the screwdriver tip on the screw depends on it being exactly square. And the longer the screwdriver, the more chance you have of getting it properly lined up and exactly right. If you use a very stubby screwdriver, it's very difficult to tell if you're holding it at an angle. If you have a very long one, you know immediately, which means you get better purchase on the screw and you stand more chance of undoing a stubborn one with a long screwdriver. It's the end of interesting screwdriver facts. It's interesting that there is a tradition amongst adolescent boys in particular of playing air guitar, but you can't really do air reassembly, can you? No one ever walks around going like that. But come with me.
After collecting more bits, I screw in the strap buttons and put on the selector switch cap. I can then consider the volume and tone knobs.
I'm just thinking about how I line these up, because I just think, so if you're playing a guitar, I think they should, if that's volume on effectively 0, that is tone 1, that is tone 2. So now look, if you imagine that you are the eye of the player, and you see the words the right way up to you and all square, they're all on minimum. That's volume up, that's that tone knob going clockwise and that tone knob going clockwise. Any objections? Apart from, it really doesn't matter, get on with it. Right, now we're going to attach the machine heads. These are the things that will tension the strings for you, tune it, with tiny, tiny, tiny little screws. And we need the neck, and as well as the neck, we need the nut that goes onto the truss rod, which is inside it. Machine heads. 2 of them, there's one, have an extra bit on the end. That one has an extra bit on the end, and you will see why as I put them into the back of the neck, locate them. They've each got a little pin on. There's a little hole, series of little holes there that locate those, and then little holes where the screws go in to join them all together. So there's sort of standalone screw in the end one, and then every other screw secures two. I'm having to use the greatest screwdriver in the world because it's the only one I have with a tip even vaguely close to that size. That's very guitar-y, isn't it, having those there? I meant to tell you earlier on, actually, about the very first experiments with solid electric guitars, as opposed to the early electric guitars, which were really acoustic guitars with electric pickups in. There's a difference between that and a completely solid one like this, where there is no acoustic amplification of the sound at all. And there was a chap in America experimented with the idea and came up with a fairly straight guitar that he called the log. And he showed it to Gibson, the guitar makers. He was dissatisfied with the acoustic electric guitar because he thought the two means of amplification conflicted with each other. He showed his log to them, and they said it looked like a broomstick with a pickup, and they didn't like it. So he went away, he actually performed with it, and the audience didn't like it either because it didn't look like a guitar. So he ended up sawing just the front off a conventional acoustic guitar and pinning it to his log so that it looked like a guitar, and then people liked it. And then he went back to Gibson, and after they'd studied a bit, they agreed to start making something very similar. And his name was, you've probably guessed by now, that was Les Paul. Right, we just have to put this on. Rather than try and explain what this does, we'll wait until we put the strings on, then you'll see. But this is called the string tree. I don't know why it's called the string tree, because it doesn't look like a tree, and it doesn't function like a tree. It's just called the string tree. And the slots have to be in that. There are two little slots underneath. And they, very small, roughly the size of a string, in fact. So I'll just give that a little nip up. And then finally, before we actually attach the neck to the body, there's a metal bar running down inside. You might just be able to see the end of it in there. That's called the truss rod, which is a sort of neck pre-tensioner, if you like. On the end of that rod, it's anchored at this end. There is this special nut called the truss rod adjusting nut, or just the truss rod nut. And the point of this is that by carefully adjusting the screw, or the nut, rather, you can put a very, very minute, I mean, to be honest, almost imperceptible curve in the neck of the guitar so that the strings remain a nice distance from the frets in the middle. I need the right size screwdriver to go in there without chewing it up, which I think is that one. The reason the truss rod is in there is because without it, they discovered on early guitars, the neck would eventually bow that way because the string tension is significant over that length of what is actually not a particularly fat piece of wood. So the truss rod working between there and down here can curve the neck the other way to counteract the pull of the strings, which will tend to curve it back this way. Now, a lot of guitarists say the very faintest of bows that way is desirable, and I am told that if I set the truss rod on this so that the neck is perfectly straight, by the time the string tension is added, it will have that very, very slight, imperceptible bow the other way. So let's... you see, that did make a tiny, tiny difference. In fact, I would say I have gone minutely too far, and that was only about a quarter of a turn, so I'm going to back it off about 1/16 of a turn. There you are, the ruler is touching at all points, all the frets are on the ruler. Cool. Right, let's attach it, let's get some strings on this baby. More components. These 4 screws and this plate will join the two halves of the guitar that we have at the moment to make a complete guitar. This is a very, very exciting and important moment. So I'm thinking about the best way of doing this, because there are opportunities for dropping everything. That's quite a tight fit, but it's still slightly nerve-wracking because there's nothing actually holding it together yet. What I'm holding in my hands is the affordable and believable dream and desperate hope of 1 billion teenagers all over the world. It's like boxing used to be to some people. It was the possibility of an escape from drudgery. The electric guitar is also the same thing. So many people buy these and hang them on their bedroom walls and learn to play them until their fingers bleed and all that stuff, in the hope and belief that it will be their salvation. In fact, Paul Weller summed the whole thing up rather nicely. To be someone must be a wonderful thing. Deep joy. Let's put some strings on it.
Five hours and 12 minutes in, and I have assembled the bridge, attached the pickups, the scratch plate, and put on the neck. It finally looks like a guitar. Now to turn this from a block of wooden wires into the devil's axe. It's time for the strings.
E, A, D, G, B, E. Should I have sung that? Now, I've got to be brutally honest, I've never done this before. I've partly built a harpsichord, but I've not done this. But I think I know the basics, so like that, it flies off and hits you directly in the plums. I didn't think it was funny. So the string goes in from the back, through the trem block. And I feel that that has located correctly. And it goes up there through that sort of, the other bridge, if you like, which is called the nut. So I would cut it off there. You should really put your fingers over the end when you do that sort of thing. I just sort of harboured a vain hope that it would hit the executive producer in the face. There's a string on the guitar, it's coming alive. What this is, I'm doing now, is sort of Pythagorean, really. This is where we get our ideas about the numerical relationships between pitches from Pythagoras, experimenting with the length of a taut string and how dividing it up by effectively having a moving bridge along its length affected the pitch. And that's how we ended up in the Middle Ages with rather academic and intellectual theories of consonance and dissonance based on numbers. It was only really in the Renaissance and the English musical Renaissance, which is where it really started, that people decided that actually other intervals were okay because they sounded nice, namely the third, the major and minor third, which is the basis of tonality as we understand it in the modern world. I just turned the wrong one because I'm dribbling on. Anyway, there was one, I can't remember which one said it, might have been one of the anonymous scholars said the more trebles, the more thirds that a man sings in the treble, the merrier it is. Should we talk a little bit about strings, which in the early days of stringed musical instruments were made out of, well, what used to be called catgut, but wasn't actually made from cats. It was usually made from sheep. It was their entrails and viscera twisted together and strung out. And some people who are obsessed with authentic Baroque performance, for example, will still buy or make gut strings, especially the Germans. They think they're Zergut. But that was replaced by nylon, because nylon is easier to make, cheaper, and is more consistent. But of course, nylon wouldn't work with an electric guitar. You need a steel string. So these strings are steel. The bottom three are a steel core wound, whereas the top three, G, B, and E, are plain steel. I enjoyed doing that. I found that deeply satisfying. I'm in a place of great calm now. Not normally associated with electric guitars, to be honest. Shall we screw in the trem bar, put on the strap, and then we've just got to find an amp. Strap, lead, bar. Does anybody else of a certain age remember that Robert Fripp of King Crimson and Frippatronics fame? People always said of him, well, you know, he sits down to play his electric guitar. Do you remember people saying that? Because he did. He used to sit on the stool and play it. Well, I've sat down on a stool and reassembled one, which is sort of uncool, but very cool at the same time. This is prog reassembly. If you remember, we put the trem bar itself is on the back of the bridge plate inside the body, and then behind there were the springs that we attached to a mounting plate, solidly screwed to this. What that means is when you do that with the bar, you're stretching and relaxing the springs minutely. I mean, it is an imperceptible movement. You wouldn't be able to see it, but that gives you that little wah, 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 wah effect. If you really push on it, you can really bend your chord or whatever. The lead, that says so much about the second half of the 20th century. Jack plug going into an electric guitar. Bang. The kids are all right. Right, there is one of the 147 pieces of the electric guitar left. I shall go and get it. That's the final bit gone. The table is clear. Our mission is accomplished. Could we have an amplifier, please?
I've just finished reassembling the 1984 affordable Japanese copy of the classic electric guitar, which has taken me 6 hours and 11 minutes. I have built Lucifer's lute up from its 147 individual parts carefully and lovingly. Now it is time to wake up the rock gods and see if this bad boy works.
So this is exactly what the Reassembler is all about. 147 parts, including the plectrum, useless as they are as components, now rejoined and reborn as the complete electric guitar. Okay, the amp is warmed up. Cheers, Malcolm.